Okay.
Send ma
Yes. All right. Let me download it first. Okay. Hold on. Okay. We will download it first. Okay. Okay, now we are opening the file. Okay. Yes.
All right. Sorry for taking some time, everyone, but something. All right. Greetings, everyone. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Selamat siang. Greetings from Jakarta, Indonesia. The Honorable Vice Rector, Dr. Henry Sitorus, Coordinator of Saraswati Gender and Inclusion, Social Inclusion Research Center of UPN Veteran Jakarta, Professor Erna Hernawati, fellow speakers, Prof. Poppy and Dr. Rachel De Pros, the Chair, Ibu Intan, and team, colleagues from Saraswati Research Center, our partner RSF, Bu Ani, Bu Santi, and I'm very glad that we continue this collaboration. My colleagues at LPPM, UPN Veteran Jakarta, fellow researchers, ladies and gentlemen, the conference participants, thank you for having me in this very special event with such an important topic to discuss today. I take this opportunity to also deliver my deepest sympathy for those who are affected by current floodings and the victims and their families. And to reflect on the situation, I would like to deliver my speech today on the mainstreaming of GEDSI approach in the post-disaster recovery. Next slide, please. Here are the structure for my talk today, more or less. Next. All right. So this reminds me years ago on December 26th, 2004. I was having a birthday party, a birthday lunch at the time, when then I saw shocking news on massive tsunami that hits Aceh in television and in other medias. Not only in Aceh, Aceh is the westernmost province in Indonesia, and later I learned that the tsunami also hit 13 other countries, leaving more than 500,000 deaths in just one day. Aceh is a dear place to my heart, and my intellectual journey also started with Aceh. So I didn't think twice when the United Nations Funds for Population Aid, UNFPA, at that time asked me to join the emergency disaster relief team to Aceh early in 2005. I was their gender advisor for the programs. Sorry. All right. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami is one of the deadliest natural disasters in recorded history, stands as a critical inflection point in global disaster management, fundamentally altering how coastal nations approach warning systems, infrastructure planning, and international cooperation. Originating from the catastrophic 9.1 to 9.3 magnitude Sumatra Andaman earthquake on December 26, 2004, the event provided a devastating lesson in the interconnectedness of geophysics and human vulnerability. I was observant when I got posted in Aceh for some years, and later to Yogyakarta after the big earthquake in 2005 and 2006, and got the opportunity to visit other countries to see how effective the post-disaster response in Thailand and India, as not only at that time with the UNFPA, but also with UN Women and UNDP, the UN team at that time. What I'm presenting to you now is some of my observation and reflection that I keep on observing many years after the post-disaster recoveries. With the massive floods that are still hitting areas in Aceh, North Sumatra, West Sumatra, Malaysia, Thailand, and other areas, I think this could be a good time for us to reflect again on how gender, disability, social inclusion perspectives or approach are being implemented in post-disaster recovery. I deliberately take this opportunity to compare two countries, India and Indonesia. The two countries that are prone to disasters and density in population, but also have similar exclusionary outcomes from different social construction in terms of gender vulnerability. In India, the vulnerability is vertical, referring to exclusion that is driven by deeply entrenched social system, caste, patriarchy that are often reinforced by state bureaucracy. In Indonesia, on the other side, is more horizontal vulnerability where exclusion is driven by logistical fragmentation, geography, cultural or linguistic diversity, and the complex interplay between state law and customary law, or adat we call it in Indonesia, often leading to the displacement of indigenous or remote population. The comparative study reveals that genuine resilience requires policy adjustment tailored to specific nature of marginalization, but unified by universal application of intersectional GEDSI principles. And of course, we can always extend the case studies into other countries, which, as Prof. Poppy was explaining earlier, might be fit in the categories or in the definition of the global south. Next, please. Okay. The social construction of risk and differential vulnerability. Well, when we talk about the intersectional vulnerability and the social construction of risk, risk here in the context of disaster is not purely physical phenomenon. It is socially constructed. So this is my underlying argumentation. And disaster is the intersection of physical hazard and human vulnerability. In this context, differential vulnerability asserts that an individual likelihood of exposure, injury, mortality, and delayed recovery is directly proportional to their socioeconomic, legal, and political status before the disaster. So this explains why, for instance, in the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, mortality rates among women were significantly higher in many affected communities due to factors like cultural restrictions on mobility and also inadequate swimming skills imparted to girls. Also, we mentioned the intersectionality here, the compounded crisis, as coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. Intersectionality is the analytical framework indispensable for GEDSI. It moves beyond treating gender, disability, or social status as separate vulnerabilities, recognizing that they combine to create unique compounded form of exclusion. An example from India, for example, an elderly Dalit woman with a chronic illness faces not only gendered mobility constraints and limited access to information, but also caste-based discrimination in aid distribution and a lack of land rights, creating an exponential barrier to recovery. Another example for Indonesia, a non-Bahasa speaking indigenous man with an intellectual disability living in a remote village of Papua is made vulnerable by his geographical isolation as a horizontal vulnerability, ethnic status, clash with the state law, and the disability, inaccessible information, Those are unique blend of structural barriers. Without an intersectional lens, response programs invariably design solutions for the statistical majority, making the most vulnerable populations invisible and ineligible for targeted support. Next slide. So we talk here about the exclusion in the crisis phase, the operational and institutional failures, where we refer to the immediate post-disaster response that often institutionalizes pre-existing discrimination through three key failures: communication, protection, and data. In terms of communication failure, effective early warning systems are a cornerstone of disaster preparedness, but they are critically undermined by non-inclusive design. First, the disability and communication gaps in both nations, in Indonesia and India, but also in other countries that we can observe. The communication gap, the early warning system fails to address the needs of person with disability. Warnings are rarely translated into local sign languages, braille, or accessible audio formats. Furthermore, public buildings are used as evacuation centers are often physically inaccessible. This failure is a direct violation of the UN Convention on the Right of Persons with Disability, or CRPD. Second, the linguistic and literacy barriers. In India, warnings often fail to penetrate tribal areas or reach illiterate women reliant on oral communication. In Indonesia, as we observe, the challenge is amplified by the thousands of dialects and the geographical distance, often leading to crucial delays in receiving information in remote island communities. The third one is the digital divide. While central agency relies increasingly on digital alerts such as SMS, social media, WhatsApp, etc., this reliance often bypasses the rural poor, the elderly, and women with limited access to or proficiency with mobile technology in these countries. Another one is the shelter segregation and protection failures. Relief camps in both India and Indonesia, as I observed, become acute microsites where protection risks soar and social hierarchies are replicated. In terms of replication of hierarchy in India, for example, documentations from the 2004 tsunami recovery in Tamil Nadu and in the Bihar floods show persistent evidence of caste segregation in food distribution and shelter allocation. In Indonesia, as it is the case in Aceh, but also in some other areas such as in Palu or Yogyakarta, while caste is absent, cultural or religious norms enforced by camp managers often affiliated with certain religious can lead to the isolation or marginalization of LGBTQ individuals, single mothers, or non-traditional households. Another risk is the gender-based violence risk. The absence of dedicated, well-lit, and lockable gender-segregated toilets and bathing areas is also a pervasive failure in both contexts in Indonesia and India, but also in other countries, as I observed, and dramatically increasing the risk of gender-based violence, including sexual assault and harassment. This failure forces women and girls to choose between sanitation and safety, and most of the times both, even in many occasions, they couldn't choose both. The third one is inaccessible infrastructure. The lack of the universal design in temporary shelters, no ramps, no accessible toilets, no slip surfaces compromises the dignity and health of people with disabilities and the elderly, effectively making the designated safe space dangerous or unusable. So even there is no safe space especially in the camps. Another one is the violence of data. invisibility. A core systemic and institutional failure is the negligence in collecting disaggregated intersectional data during the initial damage and loss assessment or post-disaster needs assessments, or even in some cases there isn't any damage and loss assessments or post-disaster needs assessments. And this caused failure to use the standardized tools. Neither the Indian NDMA or the Indonesian BNPB or BNPB systematically mandates the use of internationally recognized tools like the Washington Group Short Set or WGSS of questions to accurately identify the disability status of affected populations. Few years ago, I also did a review of the BNPB, Indonesian BNPB rules and regulations in post-disaster, in disaster and post-disaster management. And this is also one of the critics that me and the team came up at that time. Another one is the neglect of social markers. In India, assessment often omit critical markers like caste, religion, or Adivasi status. In Indonesia, data on ethnic minorities or stateless populations is typically absent. The consequence, by failing to quantify vulnerability, both national systems allocate resources blindly, reinforcing a majority rule response. This statistical violence, I call it, renders the most marginalized groups invisible, leading to their subsequent exclusion from targeted recovery assistance, a failure that persists throughout the recovery timeline. I've checked, we've also met with several groups, marginalized groups, including the disabilities group, but also the transgender and LGBTQ groups. And they are mostly left out from any from any post-disaster recovery in many of the interventions in Indonesia, but also in other countries, including Thailand, which I also had the opportunity to visit it for the post-disaster recovery. Next slide. So we're talking about rebuilding the inequality. The long-term recovery phase presents three major policy veto points where resources and law systematically reinforce pre-disaster inequality if we don't do it properly and implement the GEDSI principles. The land tenure and housing trap, in this case, as the legal and customary barriers. Housing reconstruction schemes, often the largest financial commitment in recovery, are critically flawed by legal and customary barriers to land ownership. First, the gender title trap, both in Indonesia and in India. In both patriarchal systems, reconstruction grants are contingent upon formal land titles, which are overwhelmingly held by men. In India, this formally excludes millions of women from receiving direct aid. A study after the 2004 tsunami showed that aid delivered to male heads of households often was not equitably shared for family reconstruction. Also, there are customary law conflict in Indonesia, where the conflict between adat, the customary law, and the state law in Indonesia is particularly severe. Indigenous communities relying on communal and traditional tenure often lack formal state documentation. Post-disaster recovery then becomes an instrument of dispossession as the state uses the opportunity to formally seize or reallocate land for new development, for example, for tourism or for mining, displacing the original residents, as seen in the aftermath of the tsunami and Sulawesi earthquake. The third one is the environmental racism, such as in India, when housing schemes are implemented, Dalit and Adivasi populations are frequently resettled onto less desirable geographically hazard-prone plots, for example, low-lying floodplains, institutionalizing their exposure to future risk while formalizing the reconstruction of the dominant case group's property. Then we are talking about transformative solution that also had taken place. That includes mandatory joint titling for women in all publicly funded reconstruction schemes and legal mechanisms to recognize and prioritize customary land tenure during recovery, overriding state development ambitions. Economic recovery and livelihood exclusion. This is also the case when economic recovery policies consistently favor large-scale formal sectors, neglecting the gendered reality of informal economy. Women dominate the informal sectors like micro vendors, subsistence farming, craft production, and recovery programs often provide inappropriate or inaccessible support, such as vocational training in heavy construction skills, a male-dominated field, or large loans that exceed their capacity to manage. They require flexible microfinance, market linkage assistance, and support for collective economic structures, like in India, women's self-help groups, but also in some areas in Indonesia. People with disabilities also excluded from the labor market, despite national legislation in both countries promoting people with disabilities employment. Vocational training centers are almost universally physically inaccessible, and the program failed to offer specialized adaptive support or address deep-seated workplace discrimination. This ensured that people with disabilities remain economically dependent post-disaster. Another one is
Recording in
during
progress.
implementation. In Indonesia, while necessary for its geography, decentralized authority like BNPB to provincial or district levels leads to a vast inconsistency in GEDSI compliance, often resulting in reliance on local administrators who lack technical expertise or are influenced by conservative local norms. Next slide, please. So I raise also some transformative agenda to institutionalize the GEDSI principles. Achieving genuine equitable resilience requires a fundamental restructuring of disaster governance in Indonesia, in India, but also in other countries, moving beyond rhetorical commitment to institutionalizing GEDSI across the entire disaster cycle. This includes legal and budgetary reform, such as the mandatory joint titling, to introduce and strictly enforce legislation that makes reconstruction grants conditional or mandatory joint property registration in the names of both adult partners, or for indigenous lands, mandatory recognition of customary communal tenure. Also, gender-responsive budgeting to institutionalize the budgeting across all recovery funds. That requires a systematic analysis of how recovery funds impact different social groups, ensuring explicit budgetary allocations for gender-based violence preventions and services, accessible infrastructure construction, beyond mere guidelines, targeted microfinance for women's cooperatives and people with disabilities entrepreneurship. And the third one is the inclusion for quota for people with disability, enforcing mandatory quotas for the employment of people with disabilities in all state-funded reconstruction and vocational training programs, ensuring the facilities themselves are accessible. Also, the agenda on institutional capacity and data mandate that includes the dedicated GEDSI units, which need to be established permanently, empowered GEDSI unit within the NDMA and BNPB in Indonesia, moving beyond reliance on external consultants. These units must have the authority to audit compliance at the state and district levels. Also make the use of the WGSS mandatory in all PDNAs, Dallas and beneficiary registration processes. Furthermore, mandate the collection of locally relevant intersectional data, for example, ethnicity or stateless status in Indonesia. And this is the only way to move from statistical violence, as I mentioned earlier, to evidence-based targeting. The third one is training and sensitization to implement mandatory continuously GEDSI training, including anti-discrimination and protection protocols, especially on gender-based violence and disability rights for all disaster response personnel, including NDRF in India, military police and local government officials and other related authority. The other one is the power shift as the part of the agenda. The most profound change involves fundamentally shifting political agency. The slogan, "Nothing about us without us" principle means that the governments must formally recognize and fund disabled person organizations, women's advocacy groups, and local community leaders as co-governing partners in the recovery process. This means giving them mandated seats on recovery decision-making committees, not merely advisory roles. Another one is channeling a percentage of recovery funds directly to these local marginalized-led organizations, providing them with autonomy and resources to address localized intersectional needs quickly and effectively, bypassing state bureaucracy where discrimination is often embedded. And this is the case, for example, in Palu, where all the AIDS distribution got stagnated due to long bureaucratic processes. Also, to establish independent, accessible, and confidential grievance redressal mechanisms. Accessibility means that it must accommodate multiple language or dialects and be available in non-visual formats. Independence means that it must operate outside of local hierarchies. For example, insulation from village or caste leaders in India, and to allow victims of discrimination or gender-based violence to report without fear of reprisal, detention, this is for the migrants in Indonesia, or social ostracization. Legal aid and psychosocial support must be an integrated component of these services. Next slides, please. So with that, next. Okay, before that, okay. To conclude, disasters that repeatedly strike in many countries, including India and Indonesia, as the two case comparative studies in this presentation, reveal a shared crisis of equity. By comparing the distinctively vertical and horizontal mechanisms of marginalization, I try to demonstrate that conventional disaster management is not neutral. It is a mechanism that reinforces structural inequality. The imperative for both nations or any nations is clear. The GEDSI gender disability social inclusion framework must be transformed from a project goal into a non-negotiable principle of governance. By enacting radical reforms in land tenure, enforcing gender-responsive budgeting, and transferring genuine political agency to women, people with disabilities, and indigenous communities, uh, both countries, but also other countries, can convert the immense tragedy of recurring disasters into a foundational opportunity for profound, lasting social justice and truly equitable national resilience. With that, I close the presentation, and thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Ayu, for sharing your expertise with us and also by giving us the very interesting analysis comparing between the context of the India and also the Indonesia's. And I think while waiting for the participant asking the questions in the Zoom chat box, so the all participant, if you want to ask the questions to Dr. Ayu, or if you want to ask the or you want to have a live question or interactive sessions, please kindly raise the hand so the committee can recognize you and also make you and give you the access to ask the question lively to Dr. Ayu. So while waiting for the questions, Dr. Ayu, since this your speech or your keynote speech is also highlighting about the relevancy between the GEDSI principle itself and also the application in the disaster management. So I'm wondering in this academic landscape in terms of the what they call the paper contributions, is the area of the GEDSI itself is now it's still limited in terms of the disaster management, or now the academic now is also already, I mean, like already many people also discuss about that, and this is to show about the positions, the potential positions of if we research about this disaster management, particularly in relations with the GEDSI principle itself, Dr. Ayu.
In general, of course, there are some current and contemporary studies on the issues on how the principles of GEDSI is being adopted or implemented within any post-disaster management. But to my acknowledgement, in Indonesia, for example, and in Southeast Asian countries where I'm most specifically doing research on, I can say it's understudied. Not many evaluation or studies are being conducted to see all the initiatives or interventions on that. That reminds me when I did the research for reviewing the BNP-based policies on disaster management for women, people with disabilities, and sexual orientation, LGBTQI. Especially on the LGBTQI is very marginalized, very or none has been done on that. More on the women, gender as interpreted as women, but not really the other DSI from the GEDSI part. So yeah.
So we still has a big potential, yeah, Dr. Ayu, yeah, if you want to do this research, yeah, particularly to the context of the post-disasters recovery. Dr. Ayu, actually we have our colleagues here already raised the hands. So please welcome Sir Christian Gomez if you want to ask live questions to Dr. Ayu. The committee can give the access to, yes, please welcome.
Hello, good day. Thank you so much, Professor Ayer, for your very comprehensive discussions. So I have a question here. We all know that some countries are divided for example, in the global north countries and there are global south countries. And we all know that there is a great differences. Let's say, for example, some countries in the global north are more advanced compared to some countries in the south. So I have a question. If you can give us an example, or if there are any practices or policies of the global north countries in terms of integration of GEDSI in post-disaster that can be adapted or learned by some underdeveloped countries, especially in Southeast Asia. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Christian Gomez. So, Dr. Ayu, should I repeat the question or you already got the questions?
Yes, please, Mbak. It was
Yeah,
not really
quite
clear.
all right. So actually, he asking about some practices that we can apply or we can learn about implementing the GEDSI principle, particularly related with your context in the post disaster recovery, that we can learn from the it borrow the terms with the global north and with the developed countries, and what we can learn from with the underdeveloped or perhaps the developing countries, like that, or the global south, the practices of the GEDSI principles that we can practice in the post disaster recovery.
Thank you, Mbak. I think I agree with in the chat. Anthony Matthew mentioned that the gender equality in many countries becomes even more visible after crisis. And that is really the case in the places where I've been observing. And when we talk the preparedness, I think this is very much related to the preparedness, but also to show that how GEDSI has been integrated in the daily lives, in the policies, and in many aspects of the countries. So I think in that sense, the countries in global north are much more ready for that. For example, the availability of data segregation, when I have not been studying specific cases of interventions in the global north cases, but if we see in Australia, for example, Rachel is here, maybe she can add more to that. The floods also regularly happen in some parts of the states in Australia, but I see that the available for data, segregated data, for example, it's already there, and it's very much easier to manage the interventions of post disaster recovery. Of course, we are also talking about the availability of data for the indigenous groups, and it's also in some cases, in many cases, also in Australia. It's also about the invisibility of the indigenous groups there. Yeah, I think it's also, like looking at the gender, looking at the post disaster recovery means that it's not something that we can fix just 1 or 2 days, but it also needs to be looking at the prevention and mitigation of the disaster intervention. And therefore the preparedness or the availability or the interventions should start from earlier, even before the disaster took place. And like the tsunami, for example, like today's flooding in Aceh, yesterday the governor mentioned that this is the second tsunami in Aceh. But if we look on that, what happened after the 2004 tsunamis, the availability of data, segregated data, is also not there. But also, the vulnerability, the vertical vulnerability, where even including the gender-based violence, are so prominent there, are so prone there, and women, but also sexual minorities are even not acknowledged in Aceh. So we see now that some of the areas are being what you call that, alienated, with no access to food, no access of information, no access for internet connection, no access of electricity for days. And we need to look again, where they are being, the situation in the camp now. I heard yesterday from a colleague that is also in the camp that said issues that were raised and discussed during the tsunami in 2004 is now being raised again. Means that in terms of preparedness, there hasn't been really anything that significantly put in place that makes us ready for another disaster that prone to vulnerabilities of women, elderly, person with disability, and other minorities.
Yes. All right. So I think it's already covered both of the questions from the live questions from the Christian Gomez and also from the Anthony Matthew. So once again, thank you so much, Dr. Ayu, for sharing your thought and also your expertise in the GCRIS 2025. And also it is an honor to have you as the keynote speaker this year. So, and of course, looking forward for more collaboration ahead with you and also UPN Veteran Jakarta for sure.
Thank you, Mbak Santi, and thank you, everyone.
All right. So now we would like moving on to the appreciation moment. So as the recognition and also the appreciation from the GCRIS 2025 committee, we would like to give this special token of appreciation to our keynote speaker, Sri Lestari Wahyuningroem, MA Ph.D. So in this occasion, we would like to welcome the Chief of Saraswati Research Center for Gender Studies at Universitas Pembangunan Nasional Veteran Jakarta, Professor Dr. Erna Hernawati. So to give the token of appreciation to Dr. Ayu. So please welcome Professor Erna.
Okay, thank you, Mbak Santi. Hello, Bu Ayu, good morning.
Morning, Prof.
Thank you to my colleague, Associate Professor Sri Lestari Wahyuningroem, MA PhD, whom we warmly address as Mrs. Ayu from Veteran National Development University, UPN VJ, for insightful and inspiring remarks this morning. Your contribution add value to the discourse we aim to promote through this program, particularly disaster and its impact on women, children, and disabled. If I may comment, Bu Ayu, the best conclusion, I think, that you said that we must start from project goal into non-negotiable principle of governance. I strongly agree. We sincerely appreciate your willingness to serve as our keynote speaker, as the head of the Institute for Research and Community Service. You have continuously supported and guided the implementation of this international seminar, which has become one of UPN Fiji flagship annual academic events. As a gesture of our appreciation, it's my honor on behalf of the committee to present you with this certificate on of recognition as our keynote speaker today. We hope that under your continued leadership, this international seminar will further advance and reach even greater impact. Thank you once again, Bu Ayu.
Thank you, Bu